All right. So, last talk, we've got a few discussion questions that we'll go over, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Kurt Vonnegut, who, yes, I consider related, not somebody who you hear discussed with relation to philosophy, but yeah, definitely someone who I think I could draw some good parallels with in some of his work to what we've been looking at so far. Okay, let me go ahead and bring up the old presentation. All right, so we've come to the end. And just to kind of remind us the bittersweetness of the ending. The sweetness part, of course, is the fact that he manages to remain optimistic in spite of everything. But there's that sort of ominous tone warning that this will happen again. That's just how it goes. As long as we are living human beings on the planet, there will be plagues, there will be wars. Sometimes you get Nazis. Okay, so I found this critique, and I wanted to talk about that first. It turns out that it was Roland Barthes who wrote the critique, even though it was shared as a critique with Simone de Beauvoir and others. In fact, it's a pretty popular critique. I couldn't find Roland Barthes' exact article. He wrote it in a magazine, a publication called Club. But I did find this nice description of his critique. So in an article in the review Club, Roland Barthes had argued that the plague was an inadequate transposition of the problems of the resistance movement because Camus had replaced struggle against men by a struggle against impersonal microbes. It's a pretty good point, I'd say.
Yeah.
I mean, even if they are Nazis, there are certainly different moral dimensions in taking up arms against other human beings. They're still people. I don't want to sound like I'm defending Nazis, but
Of course, I agree.
hey.
Yes, they are. They're still humans. The plague is just, as he says, microbes.
Yeah. And it could be argued that Camus also neglected an important aspect of the resistance movement when he made no reference to the moral problem created by the German habit, I guess practice would probably be a better word, of executing innocent hostages. So yes, if you did resistance activities in any occupied territory, the Nazis would just murder some random civilians in retribution. And it was deeply, okay, that also sounds crazy for me to say, in a deeply disproportionate way. Like if you trouble or sabotage one Nazi operation, they will outright murder a number of people. Not that there's such thing as a proportionate amount of murder. That's not what I mean either. So yeah, if you decided you wanted to be in the resistance, you had to deal with these moral quandaries in a way that the fighters against the plague did not. Or did they? I don't know. We'll talk about it in a second here. So yeah, the resistance fighter risked having on his conscience the death of 15 or 20 people as a result of sabotage. There, it's 20 people for an act of sabotage. It's pretty wild. Yes, and this is Roland Barthes, this picture. He's creeping out from behind the corner to ask Camus about this issue. But I did find Camus' response. And, well, okay, let's just take a look. So the first thing he says is that he wanted this book to be read at different levels. You know, not that it's just about the resistance. Of course it is. He says, I wanted it to be read on a number of levels. Nevertheless, has as its obvious content the struggle of the European resistance movements against Nazism. The proof of this is that although the specific enemy is nowhere named, everyone in every European country recognized it. That's pretty interesting. You didn't have to say it; people immediately understood. Doesn't really answer the criticism, though.
Yeah.
Let me add that a long extract from the plague appeared during the occupation in a collection of underground texts, and this fact alone would justify the transposition I made. So he's saying it's also partially to hide the real purpose of this story from the Nazis, because there was already a version of it in circulation while the Nazis were still occupying France. So that explains maybe why, but it still doesn't get to the criticism. In a sense, the plague is more than a chronicle of the resistance, but certainly it is nothing less. Okay, so yeah. It's like the Spaniard said. We're always in the plague, it's just the way it is. I don't know if I'm sure I probably mentioned it in passing, but Camus was also sick in real life. He had tuberculosis that he struggled with. And it certainly influenced him in writing this. So, he kind of had that confrontation with his mortality on some level. In any case, he has not yet addressed the criticism, I don't think. He goes on to say, in any case, the question you ask, what would the fighters against the plague do confronted with the all too human face of the scourge, is unjust in this respect. It ought to have been asked in the past tense. So he's saying you should be asking, what did the fighters against the plague do? So what did the fighters against the Nazis do? And then it would have received the answer, a positive one. What these fighters, whose experience I have to some extent translated, did do, they did in fact against men, and at what cost. So yeah, he's saying, though I didn't address that in my allegory, we know that those difficulties actually existed in the real lived experiences of resistance fighters. They will do it again, no doubt, when any terror confronts them, whatever face it may assume, for terror has several faces. Still another justification for my not having named any particular one in order better to strike at them all. So I think he means there that if he had added that aspect, then it would restrict the possible interpretations of his book. Do you see? Like if he had added the moral quandary of somehow adding in that, the retribution part, for example, if he had found a way to add that into the story, then it would have limited the scope of interpretation. Okay, fair enough. Doubtless, this is what I'm reproached with, the fact that the plague can apply to any resistance against any tyranny. Yeah, I'd say fair enough. I mean, there are arguments that can be made about the plague really being the ideologies involved. And I like to think of that as something that's also subject to a sort of natural selection where ideas, they interact with each other, and really harmful ideas, such as the justifications for murder, some of those get struck down and then some others evolve, and people wind up in extremely complex thought traps that get them to the point where they can do terrible things to each other. But it is still the choice of your camp guard or whoever to adhere to those ideas. So yeah, you can't you can't totally efface the responsibility when somebody, has a decision to make, and they solicit advice from people, friends, family, professors. At the end of the day, they're the ones who have to decide whether to listen or not. So there's that. Yeah. I don't know. It's something to think about. Like, do people get possessed by ideas? I've heard someone say that before. I just can't think of who it is. Uh, it's like being possessed. So these folks got possessed by this horrible ideology. There's a kind of a funny concept. I think it was William Burroughs, perhaps, or maybe Philip K. Dick. Actually, I think they both thought this independently and had different opinions on it. Now, this is going to sound really wild, but they had this idea of maybe language itself is just a virus from outer space that has possessed us. We were kind of these noble creatures, speechless creatures before, and we've been just kind of dragged into this complex web, for better or worse. Anyway, not to go down that rabbit hole right now. Philip K. Dick, you might have heard of him. He's a science fiction writer. He was a science fiction writer, but also just a very strange man in his everyday life as far as what he believed he was. He kind of thought that he was living in multiple times and things like that. He was a little bit crazy. He's actually a huge influence on culture as we know it right now, because so many of his stories have been made into movies and television shows and have influenced other movies and television shows. Probably most famous for what is known in the movies as Blade Runner, but it was originally called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Anyway, that's me sidetracking. So yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know if he really answered the criticism, but he gave a good explanation. I don't know. What do you think? Okay, so let's do some discussion questions. First, in what ways does the plague support or not support Dr. Ryu's statement that there are more things to admire in men than to despise? So we've talked about a lot of this already, but let's call this a pop quiz. So we can start off with the things to despise. What are the things to despise as expressed by Ryu? Because at the end of the day, it's his perspective. Well, him and Taru's diary. What are the bad things?
What are the bad things?
The bad things that people do. So, I mean, of course, Ryu is never really moralizing about it. I mean, kind of, I don't know. He doesn't get up on a high horse and say what's right or wrong. He just puts things in terms of what is needed. And he's always really careful to kind of distance himself from using a moralized language to describe what people are doing. Remember how he made a big scene out of not wanting to praise
yeah.
He says, they're just doing what is needed.
Yeah, that's what they should be doing.
That's what they should be doing. I don't know. I'm thinking about that for a second, because I think that he would even avoid using the word should, because he doesn't want to do this moralizing thing. He would say something like, that's what they must do. It's what is necessary, right? It's not just helpful or something, even if it's pointless, even if it doesn't work at all. I don't know. Maybe I'm adding too much there, but it seems like he would go to pains to maybe even avoid this ought, this should. Because remember, he doesn't try to stop Raymond. He's not this, you should do this, you shouldn't do that kind of guy. He's kind of like, do whatever you want. I have things to do, don't bother me. So yeah, what I'm trying to get at, I guess, is the things to despise. Well, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is Cotard, right? I mean, Cotard
Yeah.
fires into a crowd of people, and that would be, and it's interesting because most of the other people in the book are either just kind of amoral and unjudged, or Cotard, who's like the exceptionally bad character in the story. So that would be the example of what to despise. Or perhaps, I don't know, maybe people living that sort of robotic existence, interacting on a transactional basis with everyone else around them. Although I don't think he would go so far as to despise those people. He would probably withhold all judgment. The topic of habit is treated different ways by different characters in the book. Like Theroux, he thinks maybe habit is the key to being a saint. Could be. He's trying to figure out what it would mean to be a saint without having any God. The way that Ryu describes habit, it's kind of neutral to negative. I mean, it's not outright negative, but in the beginning of the book, people going through their everyday life, he doesn't describe it as very nice. In fact, he says it's kind of just featureless, boring or something. So yeah, I don't know if it would go as far as him despising that aspect of people. In fact, he also gives a bit of a positive polish at some point to that kind of living, when he says something like, well, that's what you need to do in order to have just a kind of settled existence, is get into habit, and that will get you through life in Oran. So yeah, what supports or does not support. So does not support, I guess Cotard is really, I'm trying to think if there's anyone else particularly bad in there, but no, that's it. But what do we see good in people? Well, we see, what are the good things? Some of the reactions to the absurdity of the plague. For example, solidarity, that's the central theme here. People getting to the point where they realize that their fates are intertwined. Whether they realize it or not. That's something I think about a lot with relation to our recent situation, and the concept of wearing a mask and how it's not for you, it's for others. And without any kind of sense that your fate is wrapped up in the fate of other people to a significant degree, the idea of wearing a mask to protect others almost doesn't make sense to some people. Right? I mean, I have some friends and family back in the States who have just lost their minds on that stuff. And it kind of drives me insane. I mean, it's what caused me to quit Facebook like some years ago. I just couldn't deal with it anymore. Anyway, moving on. So, how does Dr. Ryu's asthmatic patient reflect the doctor's early descriptions of the people in Iran? So remember, there are all kinds of parallels running. Some of them you might not even notice at first. But do you remember the parallel between uh, the early description? It's the one that we were just talking about with people
Yeah.
going through their
Hmm.
lives and forming habits. How would you parallel that with the crazy Spaniard?
Well, I mean, the crazy Spaniard also sort of has his routine.
Mm-hmm.
He's like just counting peas to tell the
Mm-hmm.
time.
Yes,
That's it.
that's right. Perfect. No, exactly. Just passing the time. And that's yeah, that's how he spends his time, quite literally counted out in peas. And you could say that the people in Iran before the plague are also sort of counting peas. Um, and I think that that's intentional. Um, remember how we talked about how absurdity isn't noticed until you step out of the situation, you know? So when you
Yeah.
see people going through their everyday life and engaging in what we could call activity as absurd as counting peas, counting little bits of metal, counting reams of paper, counting other people, um, heading in and out of buildings, transporting themselves around town. And for what? Well, that's just the problem for uh, Camus. And for what? Camus is not to be confused with the nihilists, though. Um, Nihilists would not say that there's any meaning to anything. Um, Camus would say you generate meaning. You are the key to getting meaning out of existence. Okay, so how about Joseph's manuscript? Um, what symbolic value does it have, and why is it important that he asks Ryu to burn it? Um, so do you recall the scene when Joseph asks Ryu to burn his manuscript?
Yes. Yeah.
What was happening? Do you remember?
Oh wait. So was that when he was 6? So he
Yes.
just yeah.
He was sick and in a bit of I think gallows humor. I don't know if you've heard that phrase before, gallows humor, like dark humor.
Hmm.
Uh, as Ryu is talking to him, he says something like, I know, the word fine." It's not, he's still thinking about that as he's in the throes, in his possible death throes. He's still obsessing over one word. Um, but I don't know. I mean, think about the fact that what happens after the manuscript is burned.
Well, he gets better. So
It gets
it's almost
better.
as if like that weight of getting the perfect sentence is gone.
Yeah. And also it was, he's getting ready to, he believes, getting ready to pass on from this world. So, um, yeah. And, as he renounced what is essentially something like his life. So I think that that's the symbolic value. It is his life. I mean, it's literally like what he lives for in a way. I know it's absurd. It might seem a little sad or ridiculous to some people, but it is real for him. He spends all of that time on it. He consults with his friends. He removes all the adjectives, um, which is, it reminds me of Ryu himself, because Ryu always wants to like cast out the dramatic aspects of what he always wants this clinical dry analysis and a very common sense approach. And for Ryu, what we might call moral, he would just call common sense. So yeah, getting rid of all the adjectives is like getting rid of all the judgments and just having a description of what's happening. He's sort of like, okay, so this is not about that part. This is about the burning, but it's like when he comes back, that's the change. After he gets better, he sort of resurrects the sentence without all of these judgments. The adjectives are judgments, right? Because they're adding flair, they're adding color. He's getting rid of all that. No, we're just going to have the picture of the woman on the horse, and that's it. Okay. So why do you think Camus never tells us of Qatars' crime?
Well, like this, we can't really judge Qatard for anything. It could be a relatively serious crime. It could be nothing.
Yeah.
We don't even know. It's just, we can judge him for what he did at the end, shooting people, but we don't know what actually he did. So
yeah,
he could just be overreacting about the whole prison thing.
He really could, yeah. He could have late library books or something. Which, yeah, I agree with you there. I think it's a little playful because you can figure both ends of the spectrum, saying to yourself, yeah, maybe it's jaywalking. Actually, I don't think they had jaywalking tickets at that point, but maybe. Yeah, something really minor, drunk and disorderly, something like that. Or maybe it's something really serious. Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think back to his explanation to Roland Barthes about limiting the scope of interpretations. So I think that's also part of it as well. He doesn't want it to smack too heavily of anyone in particular, but if you've ever known somebody who might be involved in nefarious things, hopefully Qatard will be able to, hopefully Qatard will remind you of that. Okay, good. So here's another parallel. Theroux uses owl imagery a couple of times. So at the beginning of the book, in our first adventure into his diary, he talks about the family eating dinner at the hotel restaurant. And he describes Monsieur Othon as a well-brought-up owl. Now remember, he's the police commissioner or whatever. He's like the head of the police. Later in part 4, he describes the man defending his life, the one that his father is prosecuting. He says the man looked like a yellow owl scared blind by too much light, and continues to refer to him as a poor blind owl, miserable owl. So what do you think about that? Why do you think? I mean, there are no wrong answers here. Well, maybe one. No, just kidding. He believes that they are actually owls. Because a few things kind of occur to me here. I mean, definitely something with the second character. I mean, what do you think would make a person at a hearing that would decide his life? What would make that person look like an owl?
Yeah, that's kind of a strange comparison.
Well, you know, when you think of an owl, like the first thing you probably think of is, or one of the first things you probably think of, is the huge eyes.
Yeah.
And when I first read that, that's not about Orthon, but about the man on the man who's being tried. I pictured him as terrified. That's how I interpreted the owl, just having wide, terrified eyes. But that doesn't really work for uh, Monsieur Othon. I don't picture him as being terrified in the restaurant, especially at the beginning before anything has really started happening. If you remember that scene, his son, poor Jacques, mentions the rats, and he says, "We do not discuss rats at this dinner table." um, so yeah, he describes the kids as poodles. The father is an owl. I don't know if he describes the mother. I can't remember now. But here's an interesting thing about this, though. So I go on the principle that these are not accidental uses of owl description. So think about who Monsieur Othon is. Monsieur Othon is the other end of that spectrum from the prisoner, the one who's being tried, because he's the police, right? Now, you might say, well, shouldn't you do like an owl and a mouse or something? One's hunting the other. I don't know. I think he just wants to draw a line between them as different ends are different sides of the same coin. Yeah, where Monsieur Othon, he's the hunter. Well, owls are hunters. But the owl in the second case is an owl that's being hunted. I don't know. Okay, let's go forward. So, that's going to do it for our discussion of the plague for now. I did want to talk about some more absurdity. And this is going to sort of push towards a little discussion about the aforementioned Kurt Vonnegut. Do you know who David Lynch is?
Yes, I actually really like him. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, me too. Big fan. He's been doing these YouTube videos lately. He looks like he's been through the plague. What a great time to be alive if you love the theater of the absurd. Yes, it's true. And I would venture to say that if you get into the habit, you can constantly see absurdity around you. Remember at the beginning, I mentioned Kierkegaard talking about just, looking at people, looking at lovers on a park bench, and how you can suddenly recognize their activities as just absurd because you're not involved. Jean-Paul Sartre, in his book Nausea, there are frequently scenes where a person stares at some object until it becomes absurd, which is, I'm sure, a thing that we've all done at some point. You can just listen to a sound, you can look at an image, and you sort of begin to abstract the image or abstract yourself from the situation, and it becomes an absurd thing. But it's all around us. I liked these next two images because they were actually involved in some of the, well, I don't want to spoil it just yet. So this man on the moon and this woman with a rocket in the kitchen. Well, these come from perhaps one of the greatest sources of absurdity, advertising. It's funny because it really has reached a sort of tipping point when you look into, I I run the risk of sidetracking here, so I'm just trying to be careful. If you look into social media, it's so hard now to tell what's real anymore. And I'm not just talking about things like, you know, so-called fake news and all that. Just the way that people have totally accepted irony as a regular part of their communication, to the extent that you can never tell when someone's serious or so things appear to be completely absurd, and then you find out that that person was serious, and you say, oh my God, how can this be? What even is this world anymore? So yeah, I did want to mention Kurt Vonnegut. So I'm thinking about doing a book called The Slaughterhouse-Five. A lot of parallels here worth mentioning. Kurt Vonnegut, also in World War II, also under the thumb of the Nazis. Kurt Vonnegut was captured by Nazis. He's an American. He was captured by the Nazis and was a prisoner of war, held in Dresden. And he was in Dresden for the famous firebombing, which, have you heard of that before? Dresden was bombed, practically burned to the ground. It's an extremely controversial military action because the war was over. And Dresden, okay, there's a lot of debate about whether it was a strategically important location for the Nazis. Some say clearly yes, and there's some evidence that it was, but the actual date of the bombing is a problem. And a lot of people who had basically, okay, a lot of civilians who had pretty much decided that, you know, it's over, we're just surrendering and seeing what happens, had sort of accumulated there in Dresden. So a lot of just civilians were killed. It was also a cultural center for Germany. And yeah, it was practically destroyed completely, the city. Anyway, Kurt was there for that. That's how he wound up liberated. It had a profound effect on him, as you might imagine. So he saw a lot of awful things. And the book that we're going to probably do in the next reading group is written in actually a very sort of simple style. It's one of the great things about his writing is that it's very accessible. But it's simple in the way that sometimes almost like a child would speak, or a person who has been incredibly traumatized. And it shows. If you think about that while you read it, you say, yeah, I can imagine this coming from a person who has been through severe trauma. So why did I bring him up? Well, on the topic of what motivates people and on the topic of absurdity, Kurt Vonnegut has a lot to say. The portion of a book we're going to look at has to do with a recurring character in his books. He has a lot of recurring characters. It's like he has his own little universe. The recurring character is called Kilgore Trout. Kilgore Trout, pictured here, is a science fiction writer who appears in Kurt Vonnegut's books. When you learn a little bit about Kurt and read some of his work, you soon realize that Kilgore Trout is him. He's Kilgore Trout. Kilgore stands in for him in important ways. The character Kilgore Trout's books appear in Kurt Vonnegut's books, and they appear in a kind of second-hand fashion, where a character in the story says, and then I read this book. It was the weirdest thing I'd ever read. It was called blah, 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 and he'll tell you a little short version of the story. You can even find collections online of just the Kilgore Trout stories. So why am I bringing this up, aside from the fact that we're probably going to be covering this next time? Well, in his book, Breakfast of Champions, Kilgore Trout is one of the main characters. Usually he just kind of pops into the background. Kilgore Trout is also, as a writer in these stories, very prolific. He's written a lot of books, but he's almost completely unknown. He's never received the appreciation that he certainly deserves. And he's kind of a gruff, grumpy character as a result. Until one day, he gets an invitation to the town of Midland City to be appreciated by another character, Elliot Rosewater. That's not important right now. The point is, he can't believe that somebody's actually inviting him to be honored somewhere, because he's gone through his life pretty much practically a failure, a failed writer, even though he has written quite a lot. He's never sold quite a lot. And a lot of his stories wind up published in like smut magazines. It's the only place he can get them published. So he begins to make his way to Midland City, and he's sort of building this idea in his head of what he's going to do when he gets there, because he's not happy. He plans to show up and be like vengeance itself and say, look who you respect, look at the monster you've created, and so on. Anyway, why is this important? Well, meanwhile, the other main character is a man who lives in Midland City who is losing his mind. He's having an identity crisis. The topic of what motivates people comes up quite a bit, because in his case, he says sort of almost childish things like, it's bad chemicals in my brain combined with bad situations that cause me to behave the way that I do. The book is hilarious because people practically always misunderstand each other when they speak. Nobody really understands what anybody else is saying. They're all too wrapped up in their own heads. The character who's losing his mind, his name is Dwayne Hoover. He's a car salesman. He goes out, every morning he wakes up and contemplates killing himself. He goes outside and he sees his face on a billboard because he's also a big man in town. His dealership is very well known and big. Everybody knows who he is because they see him on commercials. So he's kind of losing it though, because he looks out at the billboard and sees his own face and he's like, is that me? Is that who I am? So this kind of leads to him breaking down. As Kilgore arrives with a book that he's written. It's called Now It Can Be Told. And so we get a description of the book in the book, Breakfast of Champions. So here's the description. The premise of the book was this. Life was an experiment by the creator of the universe who wanted to test a new sort of creature. He was thinking of introducing it into the universe. It was a creature with the ability to make up its own mind. All other creatures were fully programmed robots. The book was in the form of a long letter from the creator of the universe to the experimental creature. The creator congratulated the creature and apologized for all the discomfort he had endured. The creator invited him to a banquet in his honor. Most of the letter, I think actually all of the letter, is printed in the book. We'll talk about part of it here in a sec. So the book is a letter to the person who's reading it. So yeah, the creator invites his creation to a dinner to honor him. So this absolutely parallels Kilgore Trout's character, who has showed up basically to the dinner to honor him. By the way, when Kilgore gets there, he turns out to be pleasantly surprised. People have in this town read his books. And so he kind of loses his vengeful attitude and decides, you know what? I'm going to enjoy myself for once. He goes to this banquet hall, just like is happening here in the story. in the story. I know that sounds a little confusing, but it gets more confusing because Kurt Vonnegut appears in the novel. He's God, you know, because he's the God of the book, because he was making that universe. And of course, Kilgore Trout is the God of his universes in his books. Anyway, yeah, the creator invites the creation to a dinner to honor him. After the banquet, he gets taken to his own planet. They take some of his skin cells to turn into a genetic soup on that planet because they're going to make more of him. So yeah, he goes to his own planet. That's his and his alone. He spends his days really just enjoying himself. Swimming in the sea. He panted and laughed some more. This is when he's playing around. He thought of something amazing to yell. The creator never knew what he was going to yell, since the creator had no control over him. The man himself got to decide what he was going to do next and why. After a dip one day, for instance, the man yelled this, "Cheese!" Another time he yelled, "Wouldn't you rather drive a Buick?" The only other big animal on the Virgin Planet was an angel who visited the man occasionally. He was a messenger and investigator for the creator. He took the form of an 800-pound male cinnamon bear. He was a robot too, and so was the creator, according to Kilgore Trout. So this is interesting because the universe is entirely mechanistic, and not only that, God is mechanistic. Who is that? Do you know who Baruch Spinoza was? The philosopher. He had a similar idea that even God doesn't have free will. Anyway, so the bear was trying to figure out why the man did what he did. He would ask, for instance, "Why did you yell cheese?" And the man would tell him mockingly, "Because I felt like it, you stupid machine." Here's what the man's tombstone on the Virgin Planet looked like at the end of the book. So we get the picture of the tombstone. I couldn't find a better picture of it. It's funny because Kurt Vonnegut draws these little pictures in the book. So these are his. They're not particularly great pictures, but sometimes they're very funny. So the tombstone of the man says, "Not even the creator of the universe knew what the man was going to say next. Perhaps the man was a better universe in its infancy." Now, how does this relate back to our story? Well, Dwayne Hoover, in the depths of his practically psychotic break, sees Kilgore Trout across the room at the banquet hall, and he's actually already gotten kind of obsessed with him because he keeps hearing about Kilgore Trout is coming, and he starts to believe Kilgore Trout is going to tell me the solution to my problem. He's got a message. I know he does. So he sees Kilgore Trout, goes over to him. "Do you have my message?" Kilgore Trout happens to be carrying that book with him. So the man picks it up, well, Dwayne Hoover picks it up and starts reading it. And he believes that the letter is written to him. It's a very cool idea for how to progress the scene, I think. Yeah, he picks up the book that I was just describing to you, and it's that letter to him. "Is this it? Is this it?" "Yes, that's it," croaked Trout. Trout doesn't even want to deal with him. He just thinks he's a crazy person, which he is. So Dwayne begins to read as though starved for print, and speed reading. The speed reading course he had taken at the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, allowed him to make a perfect pig of himself with pages and words. "Dear sir, poor sir, brave sir." So this is part of the letter. "You are an experiment by the creator of the universe. You're the only creature in the universe who has free will. You're the one who has to figure out what to do next and why. Everyone else is a robot, a machine. Some persons seem to like you, others seem to hate you, and you must wonder why. They're simply liking machines and hating machines. You are pooped and demoralized." That's exhausted and demoralized, read Dwayne. "Why wouldn't you be? Of course, it's exhausting having to reason all the time in a universe which wasn't meant to be reasonable. So you might recognize some themes here. The universe, even though it's made by this automaton God and it's sort of mechanistic, it's not reasonable. It's absurd, in other words. He keeps reading. "You are surrounded by loving machines, hating machines. Greedy machines, unselfish machines, brave machines, cowardly machines, truthful machines, lying machines, funny machines, solemn machines, he read. Their only purpose is to stir you up in every conceivable way, so the creator of the universe can watch your reactions. They can no more feel reason than your grandfather clocks. The creator of the universe would now like to apologize, not only for the capricious, jostling companionship he provided during the test, but for the trashy, stinking condition of the planet itself. The creator programmed robots to abuse it for millions of years. So it would be a poisonous, festering cheese when you got there. He also made sure it would be desperately crowded by programming robots, regardless of their living conditions, to crave sexual intercourse and adore infants more than almost anything. Dwayne does not react well to this. I don't want to go too much more into the story, but you can hopefully see why I've brought it up. It is what Dwayne does next. Well, let's just say he totally accepts that as reality. There's another danger of a type of reaction that a person can have to the absurd. That reaction could be solipsism, isolation. Do you know what solipsism is?
No.
It's the belief that only your subjective reality is real.
Oh.
It's what was just being described. Dwayne Hoover's reaction is to accept his solipsism. So he immediately he begins going on a violent rampage through town because he's like, hey, look, it's that person robot who bothered me. And like, oh, wow, you're never supposed to hit a woman, right? Wrong. And he just does terrible things because he's suddenly accepted that everyone is there just to stir him up and they don't have the ability to feel anything. This, of course, is not something that Kurt Vonnegut is sort of recommending. He wants us to see the danger of solipsism and how even if it's not operating on such an obvious level as it is for Dwayne Hoover, who literally accepts it to be an absolute reality, it can happen in lesser degrees, and people can be self-centered in a way that they do not have empathy for other people. Maybe not going so far as to think that they are literally robots, but something like that. I mean, if you look back at the way that people have considered, for example, the pain of animals, like Descartes said that they're just sort of automatons, and when they make painful exclamations, it's because they're sort of like a clockwork machine that is designed to do that. So people can certainly extend that logic to other people, and they do. So incidentally, though, this is not the story we're going to be doing in the book club. We're going to be doing Slaughterhouse-5 first. These are also good because they're not too long. They're the right length for what we're planning to do. So yeah, despair as a possible reaction to the absurd. But to bring it back home, we hopefully would go with solidarity instead. Yeah, that's it for now. So do you want to join the next group? It'd be cool to have someone to soldier along with me.
Yes, definitely. I'd love to.
Great.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Cool. Okay, so it'll probably be a couple weeks because we're going to promote it and try to get a new group together.
Yeah.
And yeah, one way or another. I will certainly be in contact with you as soon as we have set the date.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
No, not really. Nothing comes to mind.
Okay. Well, feel free to contact me if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the book club.
Thank you. I'm very glad to hear that. Bye.
Bye.